In the stillness of winter in 1692, a sort of creeping dread fell over the small village of Salem in what is today the state of Massachusetts. Salem, Massachusetts is going to become site of the most infamous witch hunt in all of American, at this point, American colonial history. Today, I'm going to walk through what happened and then try to give you some understanding as to why it happened and why it matters. Now, to understand the basics of Salem, though, we have to go back across the sea to Europe, deep into the soul of what had been Christendom. The idea of the witch was no idle superstition to Europeans, it was theology. Across Europe, beginning in the 15th century, Christian authorities constructed a systematic belief in the idea of witches. No longer merely the village healer or a local cunning woman, the witch was now redefined as a heretic and one that was in league with Satan himself. Manuals were written and proliferated thanks to the printing press. Ones like the infamous one pictured on the screen, the Malus Maleficarum, the witch's hammer, first published all the way back in 1487. Those books laid out in extreme and somewhat lurid details how witches were said to fly, that could conjure storms, curse children, and of course, engage in sexual intercourse with demons. Witch hunts were common throughout Europe, but erupted in the Rhineland, France, Scotland, and Switzerland throughout the late 15th and early 16th centuries. By some estimates, more than 40,000 people, mostly women, but not exclusively, were executed in Europe between 1450 and 1750. New England, settled by Calvinist Puritans in the early 1600s, inherited all of these beliefs. Ministers warned their flocks of the devil's snares. The law codes of Massachusetts and Connecticut expressly banned witchcraft. The legal basis for this often coming from Exodus 22:18, quote, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Trials occurred sporadically in the colonies throughout the 17th century. In Hartford, Connecticut in 1662, and in Charlestown in 1680. But none reached the scale or intensity of what would happen in Salem. Central to this worldview was the belief that the devil could grant his servants a quote unquote spectral body, one that was capable of tormenting the innocent invisibly. If your milk spoiled, if you got sick, if your crops failed, it wasn't misfortune. It might be the malice of someone in your village. And of course, behind that malice was always Satan himself. No figure better encapsulates the complex mingling of science, superstition, and Puritan piety quite like Cotton Mather. A Harvard trained minister and son of the influential Increase Mather, his first name is Increase, Cotton was a man of enormous learning. He was also a man deeply concerned with spiritual welfare. In 1689, he published memorable providences relating to witchcrafts and possessions. They didn't care about catchy titles back then. A harrowing account of the supposed possession of the children in the Goodwin family in Boston. Mather would write, quote, "They barked like dogs. They were struck dumb, their limbs convulsed, their senses overcome," end quote. But what was the source of all of these maladies? Well, Mather was clear. It was a local washerwoman accused of witchcraft. Mather personally observed the children and documented their torments in clinical, yet faith driven prose. He concluded that Satan had indeed found an agent in the woman. The book was widely read in New England, and among its readers, maybe, were 11-year-old Abigail Williams, niece of the Reverend Samuel Parris in Salem Village. Mather's work laid the intellectual groundwork for accepting the reality of invisible affliction and demonic manipulation. He would later claim that while he urged caution in the use of spectral evidence, he believed firmly that witches were among them and they ought to be rooted out. He wrote, quote, "Witches ought to be accused of a certain kind of treason," in a 1692 sermon, the exact same year as the Salem witch trials. "And the civil magistrate may act against it, as they would against those that would overthrow the Commonwealth." There he's referring to Massachusetts. So let's turn our attention now to Salem. In January of 1692, in the home of Reverend Paris, a household crisis began to unfold. His daughter, Betty, then aged 9, and his niece, Abigail, 11, began to suffer fits. Now, of course, that's not an actual picture of Abigail Paris. That's Winona Ryder from the film adaptation, The Crucible. Abby is portrayed as significantly older in the film version and in Arthur Miller's plays. Otherwise, if you know the plot, it doesn't particularly work for an 11-year-old. Going back to the story at hand, the children were observed. They screamed, they convulsed, they threw objects, they claimed invisible hands were choking or pinching them. Some toddlers do this still today, but whatever. A doctor, William Griggs, was called and gave a stark diagnosis. He would write that the girls were under, quote, "an evil hand," end quote. Within weeks, the girls exhibited more symptoms, and more girls as well. The list afflicted expanded. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and others. Under pressure to name their tormentors, the girls accused 3 women: Sarah Good, a local beggar; Sarah Osborne, a sickly church absent landowner; and Tituba, this is pronounced different ways, a West Indian woman who was actually enslaved by the Reverend Paris. At her examination, Tituba offered a shocking confession. She would tell those assembled, quote, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." She described strange familiars, black dogs, red cats, and flying on poles. She said there were other witchers in Salem too, working with her, saying, quote, "There be 4 women and 1 man," end quote. Whether Tituba had been coached, coerced, or deluded, her confession electrified the colony. If witches were conspiring, they must be rooted out, swiftly and without mercy. The months that followed saw Salem descend into chaos. Accusations multiplied. The afflicted girls pointed fingers with increasing fervor, often at those who had spoken out, coincidentally, against the Putnam family or the Reverend Paris. The political vacuum and social rivalries of Salem Village, I'll talk about this more later, provided the perfect fuel for the fire. Then, in May 1692, Governor William Phips established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Chief Justice William Stoughton, a rigid and godly man, presided over it. Critically, the court decided it would admit spectral evidence, that is, testimony that the accused spirit had tormented someone in a dream or in a vision. There's no alibi for spectral evidence. You don't have to be there. And also, there's no way to prove it, and there's no way to disprove it. Rebecca Nurse, always described as a saintly woman of 71, was accused and condemned. Her family's pleas were ignored. As she was led to the gallows on July 19th, she maintained her innocence, saying, quote, "I am as innocent as the child unborn," end quote. She swung from the noose, all the same. In all, 19 people were hanged. Giles Corey, refusing to submit to the court's jurisdiction so that his property wasn't forfeit, was pressed to death with stones. It took 3 agonizing days for him to die, his only words being, quote, "More. Wait." Hundreds were accused. Jails overflowed. Fear became self-perpetuating. Even the wife of the governor, Lady Mary Phips, was rumored to be under suspicion, and still all the while the trials continued. But by fall, the skepticisms grew. As accusations reached Boston, elites and social fabric began to fray. Doubt started to spread among the colony's leaders now that notable people were being accused. Increase Mather, long a voice of religious authority, issued a stern rebuke in, quote, cases of conscience concerning evil spirit. There he wrote, it were better that 10 suspected wishes should escape than one innocent person should be condemned. Governor Phipps responded by dissolving the court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692. There was a new court that was duly convened. However, this one rejected spectral evidence, and therefore, within months, most of the remaining prisoners were released, and no further executions. By the spring of 1693, the witch related panic had largely subsided. The aftermath of the trial was a slow, painful reckoning. In 1697, the colony declared a day of fasting and reflection. That same year, Judge Samuel Sewell stood in his pew and publicly repented, quote, God has visited me for my sins, end quote. He had been one of the presiding judges in the court of Oyer and Terminer. As a punishment for himself, he wore a haircloth for years thereafter. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., one of the chief accusers, stood before the Salem village church, and she confessed, quote, I desire to be humbled before God for that sad and humbling providence that befell my father's family. Restitution came more slowly. In 1711, the colony granted compensation to the heirs of those wrongfully executed. But money could not undo what had been done. It would take until the year 2001 for all those who were condemned to be officially exonerated by the state of Massachusetts. The Salem witch trials endure, I think, still today because they reveal something that's in all of us, something elemental. The yearning for order amid chaos. The temptation is always to blame those on the outside, and the ease with which fear can be weaponized. They remind us that justice without due process is not justice at all. These trials, though, also mark the end of an age. Though belief in witches would continue, Salem actually marks the last time in world history, not just American history, that the full force of the state would be used to combat a supernatural threat. In the century since, authors and dramatists and scholars have returned to Salem over and over again. To some, it's a parable of the dangers of fanaticism. To others, it's a cautionary tale about political power and social control. But what really caused the witch trials? I mean, I'm going to ignore the argument that there were real witches there because I think that's ridiculous. But setting that aside for the moment, one of the most enduring explanations is, of course, religion. Salem Village was a place drenched in Puritan ideology, a society where they were just taught that the devil was there with them in tangible form. To these settlers, life was a fragile thread suspended between salvation and damnation. The ministers who preached from their wooden pulpits painted the devil as a constant presence, luring the weak and tempting even the righteous. Cotton Mather, as I had said before, warned of, quote, an army of devils, end quote, among the people. In such an atmosphere, is it surprising at all that we would go from spiritual anxiety to full blown witch panic in the matter of a couple of days? I don't think so. Now, others have traced the cause to social tensions roiling beneath the surface in Salem. Salem Village in 1692 was a township almost completely divided. There were old feuds over property lines, church appointments, and family alliances simmering under the surface. Many historians have pointed out that accusations actually tended to just follow along these fault lines. Many of the accusers were actually from poorer farming families who resented the wealthier, more commercially minded neighbors that were closer to Salem town. Witchcraft, in this view, became a weapon of the disenfranchised against the rising tide of mercantile prosperity. Then, of course, there's the theory of psychological contagion. In a rigid, high pressure society like Salem's, the stress of constant surveillance for sin, the dangers of frontier life, the ever present threat of Native American attacks created the perfect incubator for mass hysteria. The fits and strange behavior of young girls like Betty Paris and Abigail Williams may have been unconscious cries for help, ways of expressing rebellion in a society that offered few acceptable outlets for emotional distress. Once the first accusations were made, fear itself became contagious. Each new arrest and subsequent confession validated the terror of the last until basically everyone in town could see witches in their midst. Now, a more physiological theory surfaced in the 1970s when Linda Copperell suggested that the villagers' symptoms, hallucinations, convulsions, the sense of doom, might have been ergot poisoning. Ergot, which you can see pictured there, is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. And those were the grains that were 90% of the diet of the people of Salem. And if you consume it, it can produce a chemical response very similar to what you get with LSD. Contaminated bread could have introduced a real physical madness into Salem's kitchens and taverns. While this theory remains controversial, and many historians dispute its likelihood, it does capture the eerie blending of natural and supernatural in Salem. Now, there were political factors too. At the time of the trials, Massachusetts was going through a political crisis. Its original charter had been revoked by the English crown, and a new one had only just been implemented. In the instability and uncertainty that followed, the judicial system was fragile and had to be put together ad hoc. Governor William Phips, newly arrived and eager to assert control, allowed the establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which relied heavily on spectral evidence. It was a legal house of cards, vulnerable to almost the immediate collapse of fear and ambition. Finally, some scholars have emphasized the role of gender. Nearly all the accused were women, many of them marginalized either by poverty, widowhood, or a refusal to conform to expected norms of female behavior. This was a world where women were expected to be silent, obedient, and pious. Those who stepped outside the prescribed boundaries became easy targets. As historian Carol Carson has pointed out, the Salem witch trials can be seen as a violent reaffirmation of gender hierarchies at a moment when traditional power structures were under external threat. Now, it's impossible for me or for anyone, I think, to say exactly how many of these causes contributed. Probably many of them, maybe not the ergot, but maybe. But I think at the end, one of the big takeaways from Salem is that it continued to influence the people of the colonies that they needed legal protections. They needed the rule of law. They needed a system where the law played to everybody equally. And of course, ultimately, everyone in the colonies will come to the conclusion that you needed freedom of religion and you needed a separation of church and state. These are ideas that will continue to percolate all the way through the American Revolution.